The summer of 1963 hit the Oklahoma Panhandle like a hammer on an anvil. Day after day, the sun beat down on the parched earth with a fury that seemed almost personal. For James Mitchell, a third-generation wheat farmer working 640 acres outside of Boise City, that summer would test everything his grandfather had taught him about resilience, resourcefulness, and the old ways of working the land. James had inherited the farm from his father in 1959, and with it came all the hopes and burdens that 3 generations of Mitchells had poured into that red Oklahoma soil. The farm had a good well, drilled back in 1947 when his father had scraped together enough money to hire a drilling crew. That well had been their lifeline through dry seasons and dust storms, pumping cool, clear water from 180 feet below the surface. It had watered livestock, filled troughs, supplied the house, and kept their modest vegetable garden alive when the rains refused to come. But in late June of 1963, something changed. James noticed it first when he went to water the cattle one morning. The electric pump that had reliably drawn water for 16 years was straining, making a sound he'd never heard before, a labored whine that spoke of something wrong deep below. By evening, the flow had slowed to a trickle. By the next morning, nothing came up at all. James did what any practical farmer would do. He checked the pump motor, examined the pressure tank, inspected every fitting and valve he could reach. Everything appeared fine on the surface, but the water simply wasn't coming. He called in Roy Henderson, a well man from Guymon who'd been servicing pumps and wells across the Panhandle since before the war. Roy dropped a measuring tape down the well and came back with news that hit James like a punch to the gut. "Your water table's dropped, Jim," Roy said, wiping the red dust from his hands. "Dropped considerable. Your pump's sitting at 185 feet, but your water's down around 215, maybe 220 now. Happens sometimes after a dry winter and spring like we had. The aquifer gets drawn down faster than it can recharge." The solution seemed simple enough. Lower the pump another 40 feet. But when Roy gave him the estimate $850 for the work, parts and labor, James felt his stomach sink. That was money he'd earmarked for seed wheat for the fall planting. It was nearly a third of what he'd cleared the previous year after expenses. With wheat prices soft and his savings already stretched thin from replacing a broken tractor transmission in April, $850 might as well have been $8,500. James thanked Roy and told him he'd think about it. But as Roy's pickup truck disappeared down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, James knew thinking about it wouldn't change the numbers in his bank account. He had maybe 3 weeks of water stored in tanks for the cattle and household use. After that, he'd be hauling water from town at $15 a load or worse, selling off livestock he couldn't water. Neither option was sustainable. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with his wife Margaret, going over the books by the light of a kerosene lamp. Margaret had grown up on a farm herself, the daughter of a Nebraska rancher, and she understood the calculations of rural survival as well as anyone. They could take out a loan from the Farm Credit Association, she suggested, but they were already carrying debt on the new grain truck, and the interest would eat into next year's profits. They could sell some cattle early, but that would mean taking a loss since the animals weren't up to weight yet. Every option seemed to lead to a dead end. "What about that old windmill?" Margaret asked suddenly, looking up from the ledger. James followed her gaze through the window to the western edge of their property, where the skeletal frame of an old air motor windmill stood against the darkening sky. It had been there when his grandfather bought the place in 1921, already old then, and it hadn't turned in years. His father had installed the electric pump in '47 and simply left the windmill standing, more out of sentiment than practicality. The blades were gone, the tail vane was twisted, and the whole structure leaned slightly to the south, like an old man favoring a bad hip. "That thing hasn't pumped water since before I was born," James said. "Dad said it was already worn out when he was a kid." "But the well's still there, isn't it?" Margaret pressed. The old well it was connected to. James considered this. The old well was about 50 yards from the electric well, drilled sometime around 1910 or 1912, back when windmills were the only practical way to pump water on the remote stretches of the Great Plains. His grandfather had mentioned it a few times, always with a kind of reverence for the old technology that had kept his family alive during the hardest years. After the electric pump was installed, the old windmill well had been capped and forgotten. The next morning, James walked out to the windmill with a shovel and a pry bar. The wooden platform around the base had rotted away years ago, but the well casing itself, a pipe of riveted steel, still protruded about 2 feet above ground level. A wooden cap, swollen with age and moisture, covered the top. James worked the pry bar under the edge and with considerable effort popped the cap free. He peered into the darkness below. The smell that rose up was cool and mineral-rich, the smell of deep earth and water. He dropped a stone and counted. 1 second, 2 seconds, then a clear splash. The well was definitely wet. But how much water was down there, and could it be brought back to life? James spent that afternoon in the public library in Boise City, reading everything he could find about windmill technology and water well rehabilitation. What he learned gave him a glimmer of hope. The old windmill wells in the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles had typically been drilled to depths of 150 to 200 feet, targeting the same Ogallala aquifer that his modern well tapped into. The difference was location. Wells drilled in different spots could access different channels and pockets within the aquifer. If the water table had dropped in one place, it might still be accessible in another spot 50 yards away. More importantly, he learned that the old windmill technology, while slow by modern standards, had been remarkably efficient for its purpose. A properly functioning windmill could pump anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 gallons of water per day. In moderate wind conditions, more than enough to water 30 head of cattle, supply a household, and maintain a garden. The technology was simple. Wind turned the blades turned a gear mechanism, and the gears drove a reciprocating pump rod up and down in the well, lifting water with each stroke. No electricity, no fuel costs, no motor to burn out, just wind, steel, and water. James made a decision. He would try to resurrect the old windmill. Even if it only bought him time until he could afford to fix the electric well, it was better than watching his farm die of thirst. The problem was that James had never rebuilt a windmill. He'd worked on tractors, fixed combines, welded broken equipment, and done just about every other mechanical task farm life demanded. But windmills were from his grandfather's generation. The knowledge was fading. Most of the old-timers who'd installed and maintained these machines were gone or too old to climb a windmill tower. But James was blessed with good neighbors, and in rural Oklahoma in 1963, neighbors still meant something. When word got around at the feed store in town that Jim Mitchell was trying to bring an old windmill back to life, help arrived without being asked. First came Carl Erickson, a retired farmer in his 70s who'd maintained windmills across 3 counties during the Depression years. Carl showed up at James's place on a Saturday morning with a toolbox and a memory full of practical knowledge. "These old air motors," Carl said, running a weathered hand along the tower. "They built 'em to last. This one's probably a Model 702, judging by the tower design. Made around 1908, 1910, somewhere in there. Good machines. Your main problems are going to be the worn bearings up top and getting a new wheel and vanes." Carl explained that the windmill head, the mechanism that turned wind into pumping motion, was probably salvageable with new bearings and grease. The tower itself, though rusty, was structurally sound. The real challenge would be finding or fabricating a new wheel assembly with blades to catch the wind. "Used to be you could order parts from the air motor factory in Chicago," Carl said, "but I don't know if they're still making parts for these old models. You might have to get creative." Getting creative was something James knew how to do. Over the next week, he and Carl worked on the windmill head, which they unbolted and lowered to the ground with a come-along winch. The main gear assembly was seized with rust and old grease that had hardened to the consistency of cement. They soaked it in kerosene for 2 days, then spent an afternoon carefully working the gears free with penetrating oil and patient leverage. Once they had it apart, James drove to a machine shop in Guyman, where a machinist named Frank Lopez cut new bronze bushings for the worn bearing surfaces. Meanwhile, Margaret made phone calls. She contacted farm equipment dealers across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, asking about old windmill parts. Most had nothing. But a dealer in Amarillo mentioned that a ranch supply company in Dalhart had bought out the inventory from a defunct windmill repair service. Margaret called Dalhart and after talking to 3 different people, found herself speaking with a man named Vernon Cole, who had boxes of old windmill components in a storage shed. "What model you looking for?" Vernon asked. "Air Motor 702, we think. Made around 1910, Margaret replied. There was a pause, then Vernon's voice came back, warm with recognition. "Oh hell, I know that model. Got a wheel assembly from one sitting right here. Couple of tail vanes too. Stuff's been sitting here for probably 15 years. Make me an offer and haul it out of here." 2 days later, James drove the 85 miles to Dalhart with his grain truck. Vernon Cole turned out to be a man in his 60s who'd spent 40 years in the windmill business before retiring. He showed James the parts, a complete 8-foot wheel assembly with the original blades still intact, 2 tail vanes, and boxes of miscellaneous parts including leather pump cups and galvanized pipe sections. "What do you want for all this?" James asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Vernon looked at the eager young farmer, at the truck that had seen better days, at the hope in James's eyes. "Son, this stuff's just taking up space. Give me $40 for the lot and get it out of my shed." James couldn't believe his ears. "$40, sir, this is worth $40, Vernon interrupted, "and you promise me something. When you get that old mill pumping again, you remember to help the next fellow who needs it. That's how we used to do things. That's how the old-timers kept each other alive out here." James shook the man's hand, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Yes, sir, I promise." With the parts secured, the real work began. Carl Eriksson recruited 2 other men to help with the heavy lifting. Dutch Schneider, a wheat farmer from the North County who had arms like tree trunks, and Pete Williams, a younger man who'd just come back from 2 years in the army and was helping his father run their family place. Together, the 4 men spent a weekend doing the dangerous work of windmill reconstruction. The wheel assembly had to be hoisted to the top of the 30-foot tower and bolted onto the reassembled head mechanism. They used a system of ropes and pulleys, with Carl supervising from the ground, while James and Pete climbed the tower with wrenches and bolts. The work was hot, precarious, and demanded absolute focus. One mistake, one slip, and a man could fall 30 feet to the hard-packed earth below. But by Sunday afternoon, the wheel was mounted, the tail vane was attached, painted blades were installed, and the entire assembly was greased and ready. All that remained was to connect the pump rod to the cylinder down in the well and prime the system. This final step was perhaps the most uncertain. The well hadn't been pumped in over 15 years. The pump cylinder, the component that actually lifted the water, was still down there at the bottom of the well, but leather pump cups deteriorated over time. There was a real chance the cylinder would need to be pulled and rebuilt, which would require equipment James didn't have. Carl suggested they try the old cowboy method. Pour several gallons of water down the well to swell the leather cups, then connect everything and see if it would pump. Sometimes those old leather cups will swell up enough to seal when they get wet again, Carl explained. Not guaranteed, but worth a try before you go pulling pipe. They poured 5 gallons of water down the well and waited an hour. Then they connected the pump rod, a long sucker rod made of sections of steel pipe, to the reciprocating mechanism in the windmill head. The pump rod extended all the way down into the well, connecting to the cylinder 180 feet below. With everything connected, there was nothing left to do but release the brake that held the windmill wheel stationary and let the wind do its work. It was late afternoon, and a steady breeze was blowing from the southwest, the prevailing wind direction that had powered thousands of windmills across the plains for generations. James climbed the tower one last time and released the brake lever. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a rusty creak that seemed to echo across the empty land, the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, fighting years of inertia and neglect, but then with increasing smoothness as the mechanism remembered its purpose. The blades caught the wind, the wheels spun, the gears engaged, and the pump rod began its rhythmic up and down motion, the heartbeat of the old technology coming back to life. They all stood watching, barely breathing as the wheel turned. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3. Carl had explained that it might take a while for the water to be lifted from 180 feet below, especially if the pump cups were still sealing. Then Margaret, who'd been standing by the outlet pipe, shouted, "It's coming! I can hear it!" There was a gurgling sound, then a sputter, and then, like a miracle breaking the surface of the earth, water burst from the outlet pipe in a clear, cold stream. It splashed onto the ground, darkening the dust, spreading in a widening pool that reflected the late afternoon sun like liquid gold. The men erupted in cheers. Dutch slapped James on the back so hard he nearly knocked him over. Pete whooped and hollered. Carl just stood there with tears running down his weathered face, watching the old machine do what it had been built to do 60 years earlier. Margaret ran to James and threw her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." But James knew better. "We did it," he corrected her. "All of us. Together." They let the windmill pump for an hour, filling the old concrete stock tank that sat nearby. The tank, which hadn't held water in years, had been scrubbed clean and patched with fresh concrete in preparation for this moment. As the water rose in the tank, James did the calculations. The flow rate was steady, probably about 2 gallons per minute. At that rate, the windmill would pump around 2,000 gallons per day in moderate wind. More than enough for their needs. Over the following days, James made improvements to the system. He installed a new float valve in the stock tank, so the windmill would automatically shut off when the tank was full, preventing overflow. He built a pipeline from the windmill tank to the cattle troughs, using gravity flow to distribute the water. He even rigged up a connection to supply water to the house, giving them a backup source independent of the electric well. The windmill transformed their situation overnight. The cattle had water. The garden had water. The household had water. The constant worry that had been eating at James since the electric well failed simply evaporated like morning dew. But the real transformation was deeper than just solving a water crisis. The experience of resurrecting the old windmill connected James to something he'd been in danger of losing: the accumulated wisdom of previous generations, the knowledge that had allowed his grandparents to survive and even thrive in an unforgiving environment. That windmill, with its elegant simplicity and independence from the modern grid, represented a kind of resilience that money couldn't buy. Word of James's success spread through the county. Other farmers who'd been struggling with similar problems started visiting the Mitchell place, looking at the old windmill with new eyes. Carl Erickson found himself in demand again, advising on windmill repairs and restorations. Vernon Cole in Dalhart reported a sudden interest in his old parts inventory. Across the panhandle, dozens of abandoned windmills began turning again, their blades cutting through the air like the hands of some vast clock, measuring time not in hours, but in gallons, in survival, in the stubborn refusal to give up. By the time fall arrived, James had saved enough to have Roy Henderson fix the electric well, but he kept the windmill running too. The two systems complemented each other perfectly: the electric pump for heavy demand, the windmill for steady, reliable backup that required no fuel and asked nothing but wind. The drought eventually broke. The aquifer recharged. But James never forgot the summer of 1963, when an old windmill and the help of good neighbors saved his farm. He kept his promise to Vernon Cole. Over the years, he helped dozens of other farmers restore their own windmills, sharing the knowledge Carl Erickson had shared with him, passing down the old skills to a new generation. The windmill still stands on the Mitchell place today, more than 60 years later. James passed away in 1998, but the farm stayed in the family. His son runs it now, and that old air motor still turns when the wind blows, still pumps water from the deep earth, still stands as a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and community spirit that built the American heartland. There's a lesson in that old machine, in its simple mechanics and enduring function. Sometimes the solutions to modern problems are hiding in plain sight, waiting in the wisdom of the past. Sometimes the newest idea is actually the oldest one, proven across generations, tested by time, and ready to work again if we're just willing to remember. The Great Plains were built by people who understood that survival wasn't just about individual effort. It was about shared knowledge, helping hands, and the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. James Mitchell learned that lesson in the summer of 1963, and in learning it, he became part of a tradition that stretches back to the first settlers, who looked at the wind sweeping endlessly across the prairie and saw not just weather, but possibility. That's farm wisdom. Not the kind you learn in books or buy in stores, but the kind that passes from hand to hand, generation to generation, kept alive through stories and shared experience. It's the knowledge that old solutions can solve new problems, that community is stronger than capital, and that sometimes, when everything modern fails, the answer is standing right there in your own backyard, waiting to be remembered. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story of American farm resilience and ingenuity, please subscribe to our channel for more content about agricultural history and rural wisdom. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with anyone who appreciates stories of determination and community spirit from America's heartland. Your support helps us keep sharing these important stories. This video is inspired by real events and the genuine experiences of American farmers during the mid-20th century. James Mitchell is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar challenges during this era. This content is created for educational and inspirational purposes and is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or communities. The techniques and historical details presented are based on documented agricultural practices and windmill technology from the period.